My true story from Pennsylvania begins with the clinking of dishes and the faint smell of lemon cleaner drifting from a kitchen I no longer felt welcome in. It's strange how a home can turn into a house, how the sound of family can become background noise when no one really hears you. I used to believe that love was loud, full of laughter, memories, Sunday dinners, and grandchildren's footsteps running down hallways. But love can go quiet. It can retreat like a tide, till you're left wondering if it was ever truly there to begin with. I'm Edith, 71 years old, a retired school cafeteria worker who spent most of her life wiping spills, packing lunches, and mending skinned knees. Not just at work, but at home too. I raised 2 sons and a daughter after my husband Henry passed away nearly 30 years ago from a heart condition we couldn't afford to treat with anything but hope. We lived in a modest 2-story house in a small Pennsylvania town where everyone knew who baked the best apple pie and who shoveled their neighbor's sidewalk before sunrise. That was me, once, the woman people waved to, who brought over soup when your child was sick, who kept extra blankets and a freezer full of homemade meals, just in case. After Henry passed, I poured everything I had into my children. Not just money or meals, but energy, time, the kind of emotional support that leaves your own tank bone dry by nightfall. I was there for every heartbreak, every scraped knee, every graduation cap tossed into the air. I gave them all I could, believing one day they'd carry me gently when my knees gave out and my bones began to ache with the weight of age. But dreams like that often sit quietly in the corner, unnoticed, until they dissolve into the wallpaper of disappointment. When my knees did finally give out, quite literally, after a nasty fall on my back porch 2 winters ago, it was my eldest son, Daniel, who insisted I come live with him and his wife, Marcy. "You'll be more comfortable here, Mom," he said. "It's too dangerous for you to be alone in that old house." I sold the home Henry and I built, packed up my life into cardboard boxes, and moved into the guest bedroom of their newer, fancier place. They called it a transition, something temporary, until I was well enough to live independently again. I didn't know then that temporary would become permanent, but not in the way I had hoped. At first, things were fine. I tried to stay out of their way, made myself useful when I could. Folded laundry, peeled potatoes, watched their youngest son Miles while they went out for dinner or errands. I kept telling myself I was contributing, that I was family, not a burden. But slowly, the tone changed. Marcy began to sigh when I asked questions. Daniel stopped looking me in the eye at the dinner table. Conversations that once included me began to happen in hushed tones when I left the room. Then came the moment I can't seem to forget. Not because it was loud, but because it was so ordinary. We were all sitting down to dinner, a simple meal of roasted chicken and steamed vegetables. I had helped set the table and even washed the lettuce earlier that day. As I passed the breadbasket to Daniel, I heard Marcy mutter under her breath, "She eats like royalty, but doesn't lift a finger around here." My hand trembled slightly as I placed the basket down, pretending I hadn't heard. But I had. Every word. Daniel didn't correct her. He didn't defend me. He just looked at his plate and kept chewing. It would have been easier if they'd yelled, if they'd come right out and said, "You're not wanted." But the cruelty was colder than that. It was polite. It was silent. It was a slow erasing of my presence in the house I had been told was my safe place. That night, I cried into the pillow I brought from my old home, the one still faintly smelling of lavender sachets and years of comfort. My tears weren't just from hurt. They were from shame. I had become the woman I never thought I'd be. The one spoken about instead of spoken to. The one tolerated, not cherished. Days turned to weeks. The tension grew so thick that even Miles, sweet as he was, started keeping his distance, probably picking up on his parents' cues. They no longer invited me on family outings, and if I asked about their day, I was met with clipped answers. I stayed in my room more often, careful not to be seen too much, not to take up too much space. I began skipping meals just to avoid the kitchen. They didn't notice, or maybe they did, and just didn't care. The final straw came quietly, like most things in that house. I overheard Marcy on the phone with her sister, whispering angrily about how we can't keep feeding her forever, and this isn't a nursing home. I stood outside the kitchen doorway, heart pounding, cheeks burning. I waited until she hung up. I walked into the room. She looked startled to see me, and for a moment, I thought she might apologize. She didn't. Instead, she said with a shrug, "Well, it's true, isn't it?" I didn't answer. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply nodded, turned, and walked back to the guest room. That night, I made a decision. A quiet one, the kind that doesn't need thunder or lightning to make an impact. I would leave. Not because they asked me to. They hadn't. Not directly. But because I deserved more than crumbs of kindness. I deserved more than to be the woman who ate but didn't help. And perhaps, most importantly, I needed to remind myself that I could leave. That I wasn't trapped. That my worth wasn't measured by their convenience. So I packed my things slowly, deliberately, making sure to leave nothing behind but the silence they'd built around me. I didn't leave a note. I didn't slam the door. I just left. And that's where the second chapter of my story begins. The one they never expected, and the one I now carry with pride. The morning I left Daniel's house was quiet. The kind of stillness that blankets a place after all the feelings have been said without ever speaking aloud. I didn't even need the alarm clock. My body knew it was time. The air felt cooler than usual, and a gentle mist hung over the street as I wheeled my small suitcase to the front door. The handle clicked shut softly behind me. No one heard. No one stopped me. And as I stepped off their porch, the one I had helped them repaint the summer they moved in, I felt the strangest mix of sadness and relief settle in my chest. I was gone, but I wasn't lost. I didn't have much of a plan. I hadn't told anyone I was leaving. I didn't want a lecture or pity. I just needed space, somewhere to breathe, to remember who I was before I began shrinking myself to fit into someone else's home. I still had a small amount of money from the sale of my house, carefully tucked away in a separate account Daniel didn't know about. A good friend of mine from church, Patricia, had offered me her basement guest room any time after I fell. I'd never taken her up on it. That morning, I did. Patricia lived 2 towns over in a small ranch-style home that smelled like cinnamon and old books. Her basement had been converted into a cozy living space, complete with a kitchenette, a worn love seat, and an electric fireplace that hummed softly like a heartbeat. She opened the door with wide eyes and a startled gasp, taking in my tired face and trembling hands. She didn't ask too many questions. She just said, "You're staying. That's final," and took my bag from me. Over the next few days, I did very little but rest. My body ached, not just from age, but from the weight of everything I'd carried silently for months. I journaled. I sat in Patricia's backyard garden and watched bees dance between flowers. I read novels I'd never finished. I prayed, though I didn't ask for anything in particular. Mostly, I just existed, and slowly, the stillness became soothing instead of lonely. But somewhere between the second cup of tea and the third sunset, I started to feel something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly. Not revenge, at least not the kind that burns and destroys. This was quieter, colder. It wasn't about making Daniel or Marcy suffer. It was about ensuring they never had the power to hurt me like that again. I had given them so much. My presence, my help, my trust. And in return, I'd been treated like a burden they resented feeding. That realization broke something in me. But it also built something new, something stronger. I went to the bank that same week and requested a full statement of my accounts. I reviewed every transaction Daniel had made while helping me manage my finances. There were small charges, little things that added up. A home theater system I'd never seen. A car lease, with my name on it but driven by Marcy. Donations to a school Miles didn't even attend. I wasn't naive, but I had trusted them. That trust had been used like a blank check. With Patricia's help, I made an appointment with a legal aid office in town. The young attorney there, a woman named Gloria, listened patiently as I explained what I suspected. She asked smart questions, took notes, and told me that while some of the transactions were likely legal, albeit unethical, I had options. She said, "Just because you gave them access doesn't mean they had the right to misuse it." Those words stayed with me. We began the process of revoking Daniel's financial power of attorney, which he had convinced me to sign, just in case something happened. I updated my will. I opened a new account in my name only. I even began the process of reversing the home sale that had technically been registered as a family transfer, something Gloria said might give me legal leverage since I had never been paid the full market value and had no written contract protecting my interests. It wasn't about taking anything from them. It was about reclaiming what was mine. Meanwhile, Patricia kept me grounded. She reminded me daily that I had done nothing wrong, that loving your children doesn't mean tolerating their cruelty, that boundaries aren't punishment, they're protection. And slowly, the shame began to melt away. In its place came clarity. About 3 weeks after I moved in, Patricia and I were sitting on the porch drinking sweet tea when her niece dropped by with her laptop. She had started a blog and podcast about untold stories of women over 60. She called it The Quiet Ones Speak. She asked if I'd be willing to share my story, anonymously, if I preferred. At first, I refused. I wasn't ready to speak. But after some thought, I agreed. I didn't name names. I didn't air all the dirty laundry. But I did share the pain of being erased, of giving your life to a family who forgets your worth the moment you stop serving their needs. The post went viral. Comments poured in from women across the country. Some had been through the same betrayal. Others had carried different scars, but recognized the silence, the guilt, the ache of feeling invisible. I read every comment with tears in my eyes. I wasn't alone. None of us were. One message in particular stood out. It read, "Your story gave me the strength to leave my daughter's house and check into a senior community. I've never felt freer." That was when I knew what they had tried to convince me was weakness had become my greatest strength. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't retaliate. I simply walked away. And in doing so, I found myself. But what Daniel and Marcy didn't realize was that I hadn't just walked away from their house. I had walked away from a lifetime of silence. And I wasn't finished yet. The days grew longer, and with each sunrise, I felt a little steadier on my feet, a little firmer in my sense of self. I hadn't yet told Daniel and Marcy where I was, and to my surprise, they hadn't reached out once. Not a single call, not even a message to ask if I was alive. That silence, cold as it was, told me more than words ever could. They hadn't expected me to leave. They'd assumed I would keep taking the hits, keep shrinking myself until I disappeared completely. But they underestimated me. They forgot who I was before I became just mom or just grandma. Back when I was a school secretary for nearly 27 years, I managed hundreds of children, parents, and staff. I balanced budgets, settled disputes, organized chaos with a calm voice and an iron will. Somewhere along the way, I'd set that version of myself aside, thinking motherhood required self-erasure. I realize now that was never the deal. They just convinced me it was. It was Patricia who noticed the shift in me first. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the basement, she came down with 2 steaming cups of chamomile tea and said, "You're standing taller." I hadn't noticed, but when I looked in the mirror that night, she was right. The sag in my shoulders had eased, and there was a focus in my eyes that hadn't been there for years. Not bitterness, but something firmer, something like quiet resolve. I didn't want revenge in the traditional sense. I wasn't planning to scream at Daniel or show up unannounced to make a scene. I didn't want to burn bridges, but I was certainly going to stop being the one always rebuilding them. What I did want was accountability. So, I returned to the attorney's office to finalize the legal filings. The reversal of the home sale was difficult, legally complex, emotionally painful. But Gloria believed we had a good case, since there had been no actual money exchange and the property had been transferred under the presumption of care. We filed to have the deed returned to my name. That move stunned Daniel, as I later found out. He hadn't expected me to ever make such a move. His signature had been required for the transfer, but mine had been notarized under the impression I was simply passing it down for tax purposes. While the case sat in court, I stayed quiet. I didn't threaten. I didn't call. I let the papers speak for me. And then came the podcast follow-up. Patricia's niece invited me again to speak, this time to respond to the overwhelming response from listeners. I agreed under one condition. I would do it anonymously again, but this time, I wanted the focus to be on reclaiming life after family betrayal. She titled the episode, "When Silence Saves You." The episode exploded online. Emails flooded in from women in their 60s, 70s, even 80s, who had been pushed out of their homes, tricked out of their savings, manipulated into silence by children and in-laws. The pain echoed across generations, but so did the strength. Some had left and rebuilt. Others were still trapped and listening for a way out. I made it my mission to write back to every single one of them. Then, one afternoon, while I was working with a local charity to help elderly women access legal aid, my phone buzzed. It was Daniel. "Mom?" The message read, "We heard about the legal papers. This isn't how families deal with problems. Please call me." I stared at the screen for a long time. My hands didn't shake. I didn't cry. I simply placed the phone down and returned to the volunteer paperwork I'd been filling out. I didn't owe him my time anymore. If he wanted reconciliation, he'd have to learn what respect meant first. And as for Marcy, I didn't think she ever truly considered me more than a placeholder in their lives, someone to babysit when it was convenient, someone to blame when it wasn't. Over the next few weeks, I began helping at a local senior center, teaching basic digital literacy. Many of the women there had similar stories. They had been mothers, caregivers, workers, now reduced to afterthoughts in homes they once built. We laughed together. We cried. And slowly, I began to find not just peace, but purpose. The house Daniel and Marcy now lived in had once been my home, the place I baked banana bread every Sunday, where I watched the seasons change through the kitchen window, where I danced with my late husband when no one was looking. To think it had become a space of tension, of whispered insults and cold stares, it broke something in me. But I had new memories now, memories of healing, of growth, of rediscovering who I was before they tried to erase me. I never expected to hear from Miles, my grandson. But one day, I did. A handwritten letter arrived in Patricia's mailbox, addressed to Grandma Lucy. The handwriting was messy, full of ink blots and unsure spelling, but the message was clear. "Grandma, I miss you. Why did you leave? Mommy says it's because you were too tired to live with us. I liked when you read me bedtime stories. Do you still have the big chair with the blue blanket? I love you." Tears blurred my eyes, not from regret, but from the purity of his love. Love that hadn't yet been warped by adult bitterness. I knew then that no matter what, I had to protect that boy. Not by moving back, but by showing him a version of love that wasn't laced with manipulation or resentment. I wrote back carefully, lovingly, and tucked in a photo of us from the park 2 summers ago. I didn't mention the house or the lawsuit. I simply told him I loved him and that my heart was always near. Even if my chair wasn't, that letter lit a fire in me. It reminded me that my story, my true story from Pennsylvania, wasn't just about pain. It was about legacy, about the dignity of a woman who had been told she was just a guest in her own family, and chose instead to reclaim her name, her voice, and her future. But things were about to shift again. Not because I wanted them to, but because something had been uncovered in the court records, something Daniel didn't think I'd ever see. And what came next? It changed everything. The court summons landed in Daniel's mailbox on a Tuesday morning, according to court tracking logs. It came with a discovery packet, a detailed disclosure of assets, including a previously undocumented withdrawal from my savings account, one made shortly before I left the house. It had been a quiet transaction, just under the reporting threshold, masked as a household repair advance. But the signature on the withdrawal form wasn't mine. That one line of ink, jagged and arrogant, was enough to reframe everything. He had not only taken my home, he had dipped into my finances before even shoving me out. Gloria was livid. "This isn't just manipulation," she said, carefully flipping through the copies. "This could be considered elder financial abuse. He used your identity to access funds you didn't approve. And because we now have evidence, the case is no longer just a civil dispute over property. We can pursue it as fraud." For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Righteous anger, not fury, not a desire for vengeance in the traditional sense. Just the clean, cold awareness that I had been wronged, and that I now had the power to hold him accountable. I sat with that truth for hours, sipping lukewarm tea in Patricia's kitchen while rain tapped gently against the windows. She didn't interrupt me, didn't rush me. She simply sat across from me with her reading glasses and a quiet gaze, offering her steady presence like an anchor. That night, I called the detective Gloria recommended. His name was Wallace, a soft-spoken man with gray temples and a methodical manner. He came to visit me the next day, not in uniform, but with a notepad and warm eyes. He let me tell the whole story, not just the financial part, but the emotional history that led to that moment. When I was done, he looked at me and said, "You may not think so, ma'am, but what happened to you is more common than people think. Families get greedy. They assume elderly parents won't notice, or worse, won't fight back. But you're doing the right thing, and you're not alone." It felt surreal, this quiet revolution that had started in my bones the day I stepped out of that house with nothing but a single suitcase and a spine of exhausted hope. And now, it was moving like wildfire, not with noise, but with careful documentation, legal threads, and truth that couldn't be buried. I never intended to press charges against Daniel, but the facts were too plain now, and the damage too deep to ignore. We amended the court petition and filed a formal complaint for financial misconduct. The property transfer, once assumed to be a messy misunderstanding, was now part of a deeper pattern. The local press picked up the story after the podcast episode gained traction online. They didn't use my real name, but the headline still echoed, "Elder Woman Reclaims Voice After Son's Deceit, a Pennsylvania Tale of Quiet Strength." Daniel must have read it, because that week, he called again. I didn't pick up. Instead, he left a voicemail, the tone filled with that fragile blend of arrogance and desperation. "Mom, I didn't think it'd go this far. You were safe with us. You had a roof. Why are you dragging this into court? You're ruining everything. Please call me back so we can fix this before it gets worse." There was no apology, no recognition of what he'd done. Just fear that he might lose what he stole. I didn't call him back, but I saved the voicemail and gave it to Wallace. Marcy never reached out. Not a word, not a whisper. She had always stood beside Daniel, arms crossed, as if I were an inconvenience parked in the hallway of their carefully curated lives. And now, with the scrutiny of the law creeping toward them, she remained in the shadows, silent but complicit. A court date was finally scheduled. It wouldn't be the kind of dramatic scene you see on television. No gasps, no sudden verdicts, just depositions, records, sworn statements. But to me, it felt like justice sharpening its blade, slow and precise. Meanwhile, my life was rebuilding, not around revenge, but around meaning. I started tutoring again at the library's Adult Learning Center, Older women mostly, some learning email for the first time, others writing resumes after decades of unpaid care work. We exchanged stories in hushed tones over coffee. One woman, Clara, whispered, "My daughter sold my car behind my back." Another, Joy, said, "They moved me into a shed so their baby could have my room." So many whispered betrayals, so much dignity stolen under the guise of family. And yet, here we were, not victims, not burdens, but women rediscovering our voices one keystroke at a time. One Sunday afternoon, I was invited to speak at a women's elder rights forum. I hesitated at first. The idea of standing in front of strangers made my knees wobble. But then I thought of all the women who wrote to me after that podcast, women who hadn't found their words yet. So I stood at the podium in my thrift store blazer, holding a piece of paper that trembled only slightly in my hand, and I began, "My name is Lucy, and this is my true story from Pennsylvania." A story not of rage, but of reclamation. The room was silent, listening, seeing, and that was all I'd ever wanted, to be seen. But just when I thought the hardest part was behind me, I received another letter. This time, not from Daniel, not from Marcy. It was from their attorney, and its contents would shake the foundation of everything I'd built. Because inside, it wasn't a counterclaim or a denial. It was an offer that reeked of desperation, of control, and of a last-minute attempt to rewrite the ending of my story. The envelope was thicker than usual, a creamy, expensive texture, embossed with a law firm's name I didn't recognize. I ran my fingers over it slowly, feeling the weight of whatever manipulation lay inside before I even opened it. There was no return address on the outside, only my name written with a formality that didn't belong in our family. I waited until the sun had dipped below the horizon before I opened it. Something about daylight made it feel too raw, too exposed. In the quiet hush of evening, I sat by the small desk Patricia had given me, the one that used to be her daughter's study table, and unfolded the contents. Inside was a typed letter. No greeting, no emotion, just business. Daniel and Marcy were offering to amicably resolve all pending matters if I agreed to withdraw the fraud complaint, cease all legal actions, and transfer back the house deed to their name. In return, they would generously provide a monthly stipend and accommodations for a private living space nearby. Not inside their home, of course, but close enough so they could say they were doing their duty. There was a phrase that stood out like a dagger dressed in silk. To avoid undue reputational harm on all parties. They weren't sorry. They were scared. Of exposure, of consequence, of the growing attention my story was receiving. The podcast had quietly gone viral in certain circles. I'd received handwritten letters, emails, even phone calls from women as far away as Idaho and Maine, all echoing the same pain. They forgot me. They used me. They told me I was a burden. I didn't cry when I read their offer. I didn't even feel anger anymore. What I felt was pity. Not the soft kind, not forgiveness wrapped in warmth. It was the cold pity of someone who had seen the face behind the mask and could never unsee it. I called Gloria the next morning. She was already reviewing the letter. Her voice, usually calm and clinical, held a new edge. "They're panicking," she said. "They know you're gaining visibility. This offer is smoke and mirrors, a way to buy your silence and control the narrative." "I won't take it," I replied without hesitation. I didn't walk away from everything I knew just to end up being managed like a liability. "That's good," she said, and I could hear her smile. "Because we have a court date in 3 weeks." Those weeks passed like molasses, slow, sticky with anxiety and anticipation. I spent the time preparing, both legally and emotionally. I journaled every day, recalling moments I'd forgotten. The good, the bad, the ones that still hurt. I revisited every hospital visit Daniel missed, every Christmas where my gift was an envelope of cash with no signature, no warmth. I remembered the day he told me I ate but didn't help after I'd Spent 3 days straight nursing Marcy through the flu. But I also remembered the small joys. My grandchild's laugh when I taught her how to knead dough. The way Patricia made tea with cinnamon sticks and orange peel. The sound of my voice on the podcast, strong and unbroken. The day of court arrived gray and drizzling. I wore my best coat, the deep green one Gerald had given me on our 30th anniversary. Patricia insisted on driving me, her hand resting on my arm as we approached the courthouse. Daniel was already there, pacing in a navy suit. Marcy sat behind him, sunglasses hiding eyes that wouldn't meet mine. They looked smaller somehow, like children forced to answer for broken windows. When I took the stand, my voice didn't tremble. I told the truth about the finances, the manipulation, the isolation, the quiet dehumanization that builds like rust until one day you realize the entire foundation has rotted. I submitted the forged withdrawal slip, the voicemail, the notarized affidavits from neighbors who'd seen me cleaning their yard for hours while they sat inside sipping drinks with guests. And finally, I presented a letter from my doctor detailing the physical toll stress had taken on my body and how Patricia's care had improved my health measurably. The judge didn't speak much, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. Recognition, not just of legal wrongdoing, but of something deeper. The cultural rot that tells aging women they've outlived their usefulness. When the ruling came 2 days later, it was decisive. The house would not return to Daniel and Marcy. The court acknowledged the misuse of my identity for financial gain and awarded me restitution for the unauthorized withdrawals. No criminal charges were filed, not yet, but the option remained open, depending on their behavior moving forward. Their attorney called Gloria privately and offered another settlement. More money, a public apology, anything to prevent further reputation damage. We declined. After the verdict, Daniel didn't approach me. Marcy left the room first, her heels clicking like accusations on the tile. Daniel looked like he might say something, but then turned away. Cowardice is loud in silence. That evening, I stood outside the courthouse, the cool air brushing my face. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean, not victorious, not spiteful, just finished. I returned to Patricia's with a deep breath and unpacked the one bag I had brought. Inside was something I'd nearly forgotten. A photo of Gerald and me, smiling by the lake years ago. It didn't make me cry. It made me feel grounded, like I'd finally come full circle without collapsing. The next week, the podcast host asked if I'd like to do a follow-up. A closing chapter? I said yes. And when the episode aired, thousands listened. "This is Lucy," I said, voice steady, clear. And this was my true story from Pennsylvania. I left quietly because my dignity wasn't negotiable. I gave what I had for years: love, care, labor. And when they said I didn't help, I gave them something they never expected. My silence turned into truth. The messages flooded in again. Not sympathy, solidarity. One woman wrote, "You're not just a grandma, you're a mirror. I saw myself in you." And for the first time in years, I felt seen not as someone fading, but as someone rising. This story is mine, but I know it's not only mine. It belongs to every woman who is told to sit down, stay quiet, and be grateful. To every mother, every grandma, every silent heart that whispered, "Not anymore." And so, with calm breath and a steady hand, I close this chapter. Not with bitterness, but with power. Because some stories don't scream for revenge. They whisper it, and the world listens.